The door was open. It shouldn't have been. Archivant Pelacharo noted this in the same flat register he noted everything: the time stamp, the corridor designation, the atmospheric reading. Palace Sector 9, maintenance access, seal rated. The door stood open by approximately 40 centimeters, and beyond it, the lights of the High Council chamber threw a pale amber rectangle across the floor. Acharo's stylus had stopped moving. The palace staff had heard the broadcast. They had simply walked away from their posts. Naren Valal stood 11 meters ahead, pressed against the corridor wall, his 6-person team distributed behind him in the practiced silence of people who had learned not to breathe loudly in enemy buildings. The broadcast equipment on Naren's back was still warm. The palace air smelled of hydraulic fluid and Solhari stress secretion. The palace had been producing it for hours. Salar's voice came through Naren's earpiece. Acharo was close enough to hear the edge of it. "Do it," she said. "Tell them the truth about the weapon. Tell them what their emperor plans to use them for. Let them choose." Naren checked the seal on his left boot, loose as it had been for 6 days. He straightened. Acharo's stylus rested on his record slate. He had not written anything in 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the longest gap in his field record across 14 months of continuous observation. His blink rate had dropped to 0. Naren pressed the transmit key. "You already know how this ends. You don't know yet why it had to." 14 months earlier, the inner ring of Voron Station smelled wrong in a different way every 20 meters. 17 atmospheric zones, calibrated to 30-plus species. Most delegates had learned to breathe shallowly and move quickly. Acharo had stopped noticing it around month 4. From his position in the observer gallery, he watched the Solhari delegation across the chamber. Below, 31 species sat in formal assembly, every voice modulated to a middle frequency that made everyone sound faintly wrong, too smooth, like a recording of itself. Commander Aviath Salar stepped to the podium. She wore the blue-gray dress uniform of the United Earth Directorate, designed with the practical understanding that Earth was new to this and probably shouldn't be flashy about it. One sleeve cuff was folded twice, the other hung straight. Acharo noted the asymmetry. He didn't assign it meaning yet. "Distinguished members of the Galactic Compact," Salar began. "Earth's Directorate presents this formal address with appreciation for the Compact's patience during our integration period. We are aware that 5 years is a short time by most standards. We are working on it." A small sound moved through the chamber, acknowledgement and amusement. The Theran ambassador extended a secondary arm, approval. The Ven Protectorate's representative produced a brief harmonic, "Welcome." The Solhari delegation did not move. Grand Executor Tharvan Val sat at the center of their seating block, 3 meters of obsidian black scale with copper iridescence that seemed to hold the light almost intentionally. Primary arms resting on the table, secondary manipulator arms folded at chest level. Across his dorsal ridge, 31 capture marks had been cut into the scale, each representing a territorial engagement won, a civilization absorbed, not decorative. His resume. Val was looking at Salar. Acharo turned to a clean page. The Solhari Empire had held dominance in this sector for approximately 9,000 years, not unusual in itself, but the mechanism was 9,000 years of continuous expansion, 43 civilizations absorbed, a military doctrine so refined by practice it hadn't substantively changed in 600 years. It did not need to change. Everything it encountered, it defeated. Everything it defeated, it absorbed. They had met Earth 5 years ago and categorized it as provisional. Provisional member, provisional technology, provisional threat. What Val did next was not, technically, an act of war. Acharo would write this sentence and stare at it for 11 seconds before leaving it unchanged, because it was accurate. In Solhari tradition, the small adjustment of Val's primary arm, The shift of secondary limbs from formal rest to the position of assessment was a declaration of status challenge, an invitation to establish hierarchy, not aggression. The first move in a process the Solhari had been performing with every new civilization they encountered for 9,000 years. The humans in the room had no way to know this. Commander Solar completed her address. She returned to her delegation's seating area. She did not look at the Solhari section again. Val's electrosense organs, the faint ridges along his jaw, were still. His copper iridescence was bright. Both indicated a Solhari who expected the situation to resolve in his favor within minutes. What Acharo had observed, he would write later in his field journal, the exact moment when two entirely incompatible frameworks for understanding conflict occupied the same room, and neither knew the other was there. The Solhari had issued an invitation. The humans had received an insult they chose not to acknowledge. In Solhari doctrine, that response, no countergesture, no escalation, no submission, did not exist as a category. He made a note to file a formal compact advisory the following morning. He never got the chance. Before the session concluded, Val stood. His full height cleared the standard chamber furniture by nearly a meter. The room went quiet. He crossed the chamber floor. He stopped in front of Solar. The green fluid hit the left side of her face. Acharo had a clear line of sight. He saw her blink once. Her hand came up slowly and wiped her cheek, a careful, deliberate motion. She looked at what was on her hand for a moment before lowering it. "In my culture," she said, her voice as smooth and controlled as it had been at the podium, "that would be considered extremely rude." Val's translator rendered this into Solhari. His copper iridescence didn't change. "The Solhari Dominion," he said, "does not negotiate with provisional members." He walked back to his delegation. Acharo wrote this down. His blink rate was at once every 6 seconds. What he did not write, because he did not yet know it, was that in Solhari tradition, the act Val had performed was a declaration of war, not metaphorically, legally, formally. A species-level status challenge that, if not answered within 72 standard hours, constituted the offending party's acceptance and formal acknowledgement of the Solhari's right to resolve the matter by force. Earth sent no counter-gesture. Earth didn't know to. The Solhari fleet had already been moving for 6 hours when the session ended. Acharo filed his field report that night from his quarters aboard Voron Station, a small room with one viewport that looked out at a maintenance truss rather than open space, which he had been told was an allocation issue and had long since stopped expecting to be corrected. He wrote 4,000 words about the session, the chamber dynamics, the Solhari delegation's behavioral indicators, and the unusual asymmetry of Commander Solar's sleeve cuff. He filed it to the Gala Rossi Archiving Office and to the Compact's neutral observer record. He did not, at this point, believe the Solhari would actually move to armed conflict. They were disciplined. They were calculating. 43 civilizations absorbed without significant setbacks meant they had developed considerable judgment about which fights were worth the cost. He was wrong about this. He would later count it as the most significant analytical error of his career, which was a long career and not short of competition. The Solhari had not determined whether Earth was worth the cost of conflict. They had determined that Earth was not capable of making the conflict costly. These are different calculations, and Acharo had failed to distinguish them. He went asleep. 19 hours later, a signal came through from a compact relay station in the Crestfall system. Not a transmission, not a report, a carrier frequency, still running, no one on it. Crestfall Colony occupied the northern ridge of a moon, whose official designation was a catalog number nobody used. The residents called the moon Crestfall, and the settlement Crestfall, and the surrounding ridge ecosystem Crestfall, and left it at that, which was typical of frontier research settlements, where the formal paperwork was always 3 updates behind the people actually living there. Established 11 years earlier by xenobiological researchers studying the ridge ecosystem's unusual chemistry. By the time of the Salhari strike, it housed 312 permanent residents and a rotating population of short-term researchers, support staff, and the families of both. Acharo received the casualty report before it was officially filed. The Galarossi Observer Network maintained relay access that the Compact's standard communication channels didn't. He read it sitting at the small desk in his quarters with the viewport behind him showing the maintenance truss and the hard dark beyond. He read it twice. 312 confirmed dead, 79 of them were children. He sat with this for a moment. Then he opened his field record and did something he had not done in 22 years of archivant service. He wrote a name, not a species designation, not a demographic notation, a name. Sira Matto, 34, xenobotanist, studying the ridge lichen's unusual nitrogen processing capability, which she believed had applications for closed-system agriculture on long-duration colony vessels. She had a daughter named Ren, age 7, who lived with her grandparents on Earth and sent her mother hand-drawn pictures of animals, which Sira Matto had pinned to the wall above her research station in a grid that covered most of the available space. Acharo did not know where he had learned this. He had read it somewhere, a station profile, a researcher directory, some document that crossed his desk in the administrative flood of the Compact's standard information cycle. He had retained it without noting why. He wrote it down now. Ren Matto, age 7, liked drawing animals with chalk on the pavement outside her grandparents' house. Her mother had sent her, in the last supply package before the strike, 3 pressed specimens from the Crestfall Ridge, violet-black flowers, 7 petals each, preserved in transit resin. The package had been logged as delivered 4 days before the attack. This was the detail that would not leave him. The package had been delivered. The flowers had arrived. He closed the field record and filed a formal notification to the Compact Emergency Session Committee. Then he sat for a while with his hands flat on the desk and did not write anything at all. Aboard the UED Remnants, Commander Aviath Salar received the casualty report 11 minutes before it was officially transmitted to Earth's governments. She read it standing at her tactical display, which was standard. She always stood at the tactical display when she received reports she was going to have to act on. Her crew had learned this without being told. When the commander faced the display instead of the room, the news was coming at them, not from her. It was not a deliberate signal. It was simply where she went. The display showed the Crestfall carrier frequency still running. Green light, nobody home. She did not say anything for 40 seconds. Then she reached into her kit bag, which was stowed in the storage rack beside her station, and removed a transit envelope. Inside it was a pressed flower, violet black, 7 petals, laminated in transit resin that had begun to yellow slightly at the edges. Her sister's last shipping record had listed it under personal effects, non-essential. Salar had pressed it herself after reading that notation. She wasn't sure why she'd kept it. She was beginning to understand. She pinned it flat against the inside of her collar, close to her collarbone under her uniform. Nobody saw her do it. Then she turned and faced the bridge. Get me a secure line to Earth Command. And someone get Das out of whatever maintenance tunnel he's crawled into. I need my tactical officer conscious and present. Lieutenant Corvin Das appeared from a side corridor within 90 seconds, a protein bar folded into his left hand, the wrapper crimped at the top as if he'd opened it and then immediately reconsidered. He held it for the entire briefing. He did not eat it. What happened in the 11 hours following the Crestfall strike was, by Acharo's later analysis, statistically improbable by a factor his models could not express without scientific notation. Earth's 7 largest governing bodies, organizations that had spent most of human history in varying states of mutual competition and occasional armed conflict, reached formal military consensus in 642 minutes. The Compact's political science consultants had modeled the minimum time for Earth unification as approximately 30 years, under ideal conditions. Acharo wrote in his field record, "This should not be possible." He did not cross it out. The formal response was transmitted at hour 12. Brief. Admiral Designation, Earth Directorate Unified Command, a statement of intent. And one line, which Acharo would later include in his archive report as the most historically significant document of the entire conflict. "We are aware you believe this war has already been decided. We would ask you to reconsider that position." The Solhari High Chamber received this message and did not respond because it did not constitute a recognized formal communication type under Solhari protocols. It was not a challenge gesture, not a submission, not a request for terms. It was a sentence. They had no category for it. Acharo requested and received observer access to the High Chamber briefings, citing Galactic archival mandate. The Solhari granted it without discussion. They had never been observed losing anything. They had no particular objection to having this recorded. At the first briefing, Grand Executor Vol walked his commanders through Earth's known military inventory, obtained from their outer network database. Thorough, accurate, and entirely beside the point. 48 warships, 12 orbital installations, 3 planetary defense platforms, Earth's weapons specifications, energy signatures, tactical doctrines as observed in their historical conflicts. What they did not have, because it existed on no network their extraction teams had accessed, was any knowledge of the Harrowed Belt, a 700-kilometer asteroid field that Earth had been quietly modifying for decades, or the sleeper platforms distributed through the system's gravitational shadows, or the civilian conversion protocols, not military doctrine at all, but engineering specifications developed across 3 decades of internation mutual deterrence. The accumulated paranoid ingenuity of a species that had been hiding weapons from itself for most of its technological history. The Solhari had stolen a picture of Earth's right hand. They had no knowledge that Earth had a left. Vol concluded the briefing by instructing his commanders to begin positioning for the second phase. His copper iridescence was bright. His secondary arms were folded at chest level. Acharo wrote all of this down and said nothing, because it was not his function to say anything, and because he was only beginning to understand what he was watching. He was watching a 9,000-year empire walk toward an enemy it had correctly assessed in every measurable category, except the one that mattered. Acharo began a private correspondence with a colleague in the Galactic archivant network named Professor Zesuvant, who had been studying humanity specifically for the better part of a century. Acharo described what he had observed at Voron Station, the Solhari's response framework, Earth's 11-hour unification. He asked what Zesuvant made of it. The reply arrived in 3 sentences. "You are watching what happens when a species that has been hiding weapons from itself is forced to share them. The Solhari stole a census. They did not take a measure." Acharo read this several times. Then he opened a new document and wrote at the top, "Working hypothesis. The conflict is already over. Testing." He would keep this document for the duration of the war. He would not reach a conclusion he was willing to finalize until 14 months later, sitting in a palace maintenance corridor with his stylus on the table and his blink rate at 0. The second engagement happened in deep space, in a system with no inhabited planets, significant only because it sat on a transit route both sides used. A Solhari boarding team took what appeared to be a disabled Earth frigate, emergency systems only, no active weapons, distress frequency broadcasting. Acharo received after-action reports from both sides. The Solhari report noted that 5 crew members had initially complied with boarding procedures. All 5 had then attacked with concealed systems. 3 Solhari boarding personnel were injured. 1 Earth crew member had activated the ship's core detonation sequence rather than allow the vessel to be held. The Solhari intelligence report classified this as irrational. Acharo spent time considering that word. The crew had no viable path to military victory. Resistance was tactically unsound. The logical response by Solhari framework was compliance followed by negotiation for terms. What the crew had done instead was pay a cost with no immediate return. Except it had bought time. 70 minutes of processing delay in the Solhari boarding operation, during which an Earth communications relay transmitted a full tactical update to the nearest UED vessel. They didn't sacrifice themselves for glory. They did a calculation and found their lives were worth less than the hour it bought. This was not irrationality. This was a very specific kind of arithmetic that the Solhari had never encountered because no species they had absorbed had ever valued the hour more than the life. Vol's intelligence chief spent 72 hours filing reports on this engagement. Eventually, he reached out to Professor Zesuvant for analysis. Acharo later learned Zesuvant's reply. It read, "They were not irrational. You simply cannot model their reasons." 3 weeks after Crestfall, a small Earth extraction team penetrated a Solhari forward operating post designated Voron 7, roughly 12 light minutes from the station itself. The post held 7 Earth prisoners from a communications vessel the Solhari had captured in the first week of the conflict. The operation was detected within 40 minutes of insertion. The extraction team was cut off from their route. They got out anyway. The after-action analysis Acharo obtained was Solhari in origin, and therefore written from a position of considerable confusion. The extraction team had not fought through the post's defensive perimeter. They had turned it inward. 3 separate post-incident analyses from 3 different Solhari tactical officers all identified different points at which the human team had exploited the defensive grid's assumptions. Assumptions that were standard for all Solhari tactical architecture, because they had never, in 9,000 years of fortification doctrine, encountered an enemy that reversed their own systems against them while outnumbered and cut off. The post burned for 6 hours. All 7 Earth prisoners were recovered. Acharo filed a formal note in his compact observer record. Earth extraction capacity appears to exceed what their available force size would suggest. Recommend compact advisory on risk assessment recalibration. The compact did not act on this advisory for 11 days. By then, 3 more similar operations had occurred in different sectors. Das, standing at the tactical station with his protein bar still unfinished in his left hand, said, "They're going to keep trying the same thing." Solar, facing the tactical display, said, "Yes." "Then get me the allied species contact protocols. It's time to make some introductions." The 3 species who agreed to meet with Earth had contacted Earth's network directly, bypassing standard compact logging, offering assistance while ensuring that if it became politically costly, they could credibly deny having offered it. Acharo respected this. It was competent self-preservation. The meeting took place at a way station 11 light towers from Voron Station. Acharo attended as archivant observer, the only non-participant in the room, seated against the back wall with his record slate. Subcommander Naren Valal stood at the front of the room. He was not particularly tall, not particularly decorated, not visually impressive by any standard Acharo could identify. He had a flat, administrative quality to his affect that made him easy to overlook in a room, which Acharo came to understand was not a liability but the entire point. The Theron Collective's senior ambassador was a being of considerable physical presence, blue-gray in coloration, with a secondary sensory array along the jaw. The Ven Protectorate's representative had 4 arms and the careful stillness of something that had learned to minimize movement in enclosed spaces. The Daseth representative had no formally recognized galactic designation and had introduced themselves simply as from Das, which, Naren had later confided to Acharo, he had initially thought was a reference to his tactical officer, which had been confusing. "Before we discuss strategy," Naren said, "I want to show you something, so that when we talk about what you'd be getting involved in, you understand the context." He pulled up footage on the room's display screen. A single Earth destroyer designated the Defiant, alone in deep space, against 3 Sulhari capital ships that outmassed it collectively by a factor of roughly 30. The footage ran for 11 minutes. At the end of it, the Theran ambassador said nothing. The Ven Protectorate representative had 4 arms, and 3 of them had gone still in a way that Acharo associated, across species. With the body making a decision the mind wasn't ready to announce yet. Naren said, "We call that an acceptable trade." The Theran ambassador asked him to repeat it. He said it again in the same tone he'd used the first time, which was the tone of someone stating a documented fact. The ambassador was quiet for a moment. Then he said one word in his own language. Acharo's translation unit rendered it approximately as efficient hunters, but flagged the cultural register as significant and declined a direct rendering. Acharo spent several minutes after the meeting researching the flag. The closest he could get was that the word, in full context, was older, from a pre-expansion Theran dialect, and carried a connotation typically reserved for apex predators that other predators chose not to compete with. Not because they couldn't, because they'd done the math. The Theran ambassador extended a secondary arm. Naren shook it, grip calibrated to Theran pressure, which told Acharo he had prepared for this meeting more thoroughly than his flat affect suggested. The ambassador's word hung in the room for a moment after the meeting ended. Acharo turned to a clean page and wrote one question in his private record. At what point does a species stop fighting a war and start demonstrating what it is? He left it unanswered and went to find something to eat. The Sulhari Second Offensive began 41 days after Crestfall, not an escalation by their standards, but a consolidation, systematic application of overwhelming force to Earth's outer colony infrastructure, compressing Earth's operational range, forcing their fleet into a defensive posture. The doctrine was sound. Acharo had seen it work in 6 of the 43 absorptions. It worked because it removed the target's ability to project power outward, accelerating the timeline to terms. It assumed the target would respond to compression by compressing. Earth responded by going sideways. 214 Sulhari warships entered Earth's home system in the closing fist, a configuration designed to present overwhelming force disparity and allow the target to make the rational decision before significant casualties on either side. The Sulhari considered this humane. The Harrowed Belt activated 17 minutes after the fleet crossed the system's inner boundary. Acharo monitored through relay from Voron Station with a 40-minute lag, watching the engagement unfold in the past, which he found on this occasion unusually strange. What his display showed: threat signatures appearing from coordinates the Sulhari pre-engagement survey had classified as inactive asteroid field, standard debris, and 3 decommissioned transit relay platforms. None of these were what they appeared to be: mining platforms with reconfigured hull geometry, cargo haulers running weapons systems on secondary power until the moment of activation, a passenger liner officially decommissioned 14 months ago, before the war began, that had been sitting in the outer system doing something other than decommissioning. And then the smaller vessels, the ones with no military classification at all. A Sulhari captain's final transmission logged before his communication array went offline, flat, continuous, professional documentation, while his situation resolved in a direction he had not prepared for. He named each vessel type as it engaged. He noted their trajectories. He noted, without apparent emotion, that he could not determine which ships were legitimate military targets, because every vessel that came within range was responding as a weapons platform regardless of its registry. His last documented sentence, requesting clarification on engagement protocols for civilian-designated vessels that are actively engaging. No clarification came. His ship's icon went dark 9 seconds later. Acharo sat with this transmission for a long time. He thought about Sierra Maddo, about the 7-petaled flowers in the transit envelope, about a species that had been hiding weapons from itself for 3 decades out of mutual fear, and what happened when that species stopped being afraid of itself and started being afraid of something else. He wrote in his private record, "The Solhari went to war with Earth's military. They have discovered, 40 minutes ago, that Earth's military is not a distinct category." Then he opened his official compact observer report and began the most careful document of his career. 164 Solhari ships did not return from the engagement. The remaining 50 retreated in a configuration Acharo had no prior record of, not a tactical withdrawal, which has a shape and discipline and preserved formation. This was departure, visible in the spacing and the speed variance between vessels, in the way 3 ships briefly moved in conflicting directions before correcting. He had seen panic in fleets before. He recognized the geometry. Grand Executor Vol read the retreat reports in the high chamber. Acharo was present, as observer, as he had been for every high chamber briefing since the war's 3rd week. He watched Vol's secondary manipulator arms. For the entirety of the war, those arms had been folded at chest level, Vol's specific resting state, maintained the way other beings maintain a neutral expression. Involuntary, constant. During the reading of the retreat reports, the secondary arms opened. Not fully, perhaps 30 degrees. The inner joint scales became visible, copper-colored, lighter than the dorsal surface, unweathered. The arms stayed open for approximately 4 seconds before Vol registered the movement and returned them to position. Acharo noted the time, the duration. He wrote 1 sentence. First involuntary physical response recorded in Grand Executor Vol over 11 weeks of continuous observation. He did not write what it meant. He didn't need to. The peace offer arrived at Earth's Directorate Command 16 days later. A formal document, correctly structured, citing Solhari High Chamber protocols for the cessation of hostilities between unequal parties, phrasing that was standard Solhari diplomatic language, and did not, as far as Acharo could determine, register its own condescension. Full cessation of offensive operations. A return to pre-conflict territorial boundaries. Compact-mediated normalization. By Solhari standards, it was generous. They had never before offered terms to a civilization they had engaged militarily without first receiving a formal capitulation gesture. In 9,000 years, this had happened 4 times. Earth's response arrived in 48 hours. Unconditional surrender. Full reparations calculated at a figure representing a significant portion of the Solhari Dominion's annual resource extraction for approximately 40 years. Complete restructuring of Solhari territorial governance under compact oversight, with mandatory civilian representation phased in over 10 years. The Solhari diplomat who received this document asked for the translation to be run again, then a 3rd time. "Is there," he said carefully, "a separate communication that accompanies this? A preliminary document, perhaps, establishing the context for these terms?" The Earth Communications Officer said, "No." Silence. "You understand," the diplomat said, "that what you have described would effectively dissolve the Solhari Dominion as a sovereign entity." "We understand that." More silence. Acharo wrote in his private record, He asked her 3 times if there had been a translation failure. There hadn't been. I have been a field archivant for 61 years. I have observed 9 interspecies conflicts, 14 territorial disputes, and 3 civilizational collapses. I have never seen a species decline reasonable terms. I had not considered what it would look like when a species declined them because they genuinely did not recognize the category. He submitted his formal compact observer report the following day. It contained a paragraph the Solhari High Chamber subsequently requested be redacted. The compact's neutral documentation office declined. The paragraph read, "By this observer's third-month analysis, the current engagement is no longer accurately described as a war between 2 parties of comparable framework. It is a species demonstrating, under conditions of external pressure, what it becomes when cornered. The Solhari Dominion has not yet understood that there is a difference between a species fighting a war and a species discovering what it is. These are different phenomena with different endpoints, and conflating them is, at this stage of the conflict, the most significant analytical error available." The Solhari High Chamber did not invite Acharo to subsequent briefings for 11 days. When they reinstated his access, it was because they needed someone to witness what happened next, and a Gallo-Rossi archivant's record carried compact legal standing that their own documentation did not. Professor Zesuvant's message arrived brief as always. "They've contacted me. They want to understand the arithmetic." Acharo replied, "What did you tell them?" Zesuvant, "I told them the arithmetic is not the part they're missing." 2 days later, the High Chamber summoned Acharo to a session not on the standard scheduling protocol, arranged in the previous 12 hours, which meant something had changed. What had changed was Emperor Varath Dun. The Emperor was not a figure Acharo had encountered before. The Solhari imperial structure placed the High Chamber as the functional governing body, with the Emperor serving a role described as symbolic sovereignty with reserved executive authority in existential circumstances. The last time that authority had been invoked was 600 years ago, during a border conflict with a species that no longer existed. Varath Dun addressed the High Chamber in the formal register the translation units struggled with most, a ceremonial dialect 3 steps removed from conversational Solhari. The unit produced a clean translation. The null cascade had been prepared. If the Earth fleet continued its advance toward Veth Coral, which outer defense monitoring had confirmed was underway, the Emperor reserved the right to activate it. Activation would initiate a chain reaction propagation event across the system's gravitational anchors, with projected reach to 4 adjacent systems. The casualty modeling had not been formally produced, but the Emperor noted that the Solhari Dominion's integrity as a sovereign entity was not negotiable, and that a civilization which surrendered its nature to preserve its population had surrendered everything of value anyway. Acharo wrote all of this down. Then he wrote in his private record, beneath his working hypothesis, "The endpoint has arrived." He had thought, when he first wrote his question, at what point does a species stop fighting a war and start demonstrating what it is? That he was asking about Earth. He was only now understanding he had been asking about both of them. The fleet held position at the outer boundary of the Veth Coral system. 512 Earth Directorate vessels. 6 months earlier, Earth had 48 warships. Acharo had read the historical literature on total mobilization. He had simply never seen the literature become a present-tense event before. Solar had received intelligence from Naren Valal's team inside the palace 17 minutes after the Emperor's address. They had embedded in the palace service infrastructure 4 days prior and had been transmitting the Emperor's private council sessions since their first night inside. Solar had read the null cascade intelligence. The halt order had gone out to all 512 vessels within 4 minutes. Then she had looked at the display for a long time. Then she had turned and faced her crew. Das's post-engagement report noted this without comment, as if it were standard. But he knew it wasn't. Everyone on that bridge knew. Facing the display meant the orders came from the information. Facing the crew meant they came from somewhere else. She said, "Get me Naren." The secure channel opened. She said, "Do it. Tell them the truth about the weapon. Tell them what their emperor plans to use them for. Let them choose." Acharo set down his stylus. He had been holding it for 61 years of professional practice, and setting it on the table felt unfamiliar. He drank half the cup of water on his desk. He did not reach for the stylus again. He went into the field. He had never, in 14 months, gone during an active operation. Archivant protocol was observation at distance, documentation at distance, presence only when both parties had formally agreed. He was not formally permitted in the palace at this stage. He went anyway. Some things were worth the violation report. He arrived in Palace Sector 9, maintenance access, 22 minutes after Naren pressed the transmit key. The door was open, not ajar, not partially unsealed. Open by 40 centimeters, a clean gap in a corridor wall that should have required 2 senior palace personnel with active authorization tokens to open from either side. The amber light from the council chamber lay across the floor, in a rectangle that Acharo stepped around without deciding to. The palace staff had heard the broadcast. They had walked away from their stations, and Acharo understood, with a clarity that 61 years of professional detachment had not prepared him for, that this was the moment he had been working toward since the night he sat at his desk and read a casualty list and wrote a name. Naren was 11 meters ahead, his team distributed along the corridor walls, the broadcast equipment still warm. Naren checked the clasp on his left boot, found it still loose, moved. 3 corridors, 30 meters, the open door. Inside, the high council chamber was lit in amber. Acharo entered behind Naren's team and took a position against the far wall where he could see the panel and the Emperor, and the gap between them. Emperor Varath Dun stood at the activation console with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the final input to execute it. His 57 capture marks caught the amber light. His primary hand extended toward the panel surface. The distance between his triclawed fingers and the activation point was approximately 2 centimeters. Outside, on the streets of Vethkoral, Acharo's secondary display showed movement that looked like water finding a downhill path. Naren walked into the chamber. He moved through it in the way that people move when they have done the calculation, and the calculation always comes out the same, regardless of the inputs, because the thing being calculated is not survival. The Emperor looked at him. His hand did not move toward the panel. It did not move away from it. Naren said, "The fleet is holding." The Emperor's electrosense ridge was active. The faint muscular engagement along the jaw line, involuntary response to proximity and threat. Naren said, "They stopped when we asked them to. They'll stay stopped, but only if you step back from that panel." The Emperor's copper iridescence was doing something Acharo had not seen before in any Solhari he had observed, cycling, flickering between bright and flat gray, in a pattern the reference materials did not describe. Because the reference materials had been compiled from Solhari behavior in situations the Solhari expected to control. Outside, the movement in the streets was accelerating. The Emperor's hand withdrew 2 centimeters, then 4, then it lowered to his side. His secondary manipulator arms were fully open, both of them, all 4 secondary joints visible, the inner scales pale copper against the dark. Naren said nothing further. He stepped to the left side of the chamber and stood against the wall, and Acharo realized that he and Naren were now standing on opposite sides of the room in approximately the same posture, backs to the walls, not quite at rest, watching. The Emperor stood at the console for 61 seconds without moving. Then Sulhari Civic Council forces arrived at the chamber doors. The null cascade panel was still powered. No one had disarmed it. In the movement of bodies and formal detention procedures that followed, the deactivation codes were somewhere inside this building, held by someone, and Acharo would spend 3 months after the war's end determining exactly where they had gone and whether any of this was actually over. He did not know this yet. He stood against the wall and watched. His blink rate was 0. 14 hours of silence followed. Acharo spent most of them in a compact relay room on Voron Station, filing documentation. His official observer record for this period runs to 47 pages. His private record runs to 11 words. I believe they will not survive this war. It was the sentence he had written months ago and not crossed out. He crossed it out now, wrote beneath it, wrong question. Das, aboard the Remnants, finished his protein bar. Solar's post-engagement report noted this as an incidental detail, which suggested she had been watching for it. Grand Executor Tharvan Vol appeared before the compact tribunal 48 hours after the Emperor's detention, brought there not by Earth forces, but by the Sulhari Civic Council that had assembled itself in the hours following Naren's broadcast. Vol arrived without his capture marks. The dorsal ridge showed 31 pale patches where the scale had been filed smooth, the skin beneath unweathered, untouched by light. He sat at the tribunal's designated respondent position and looked at the table surface throughout the proceedings. He did not look at the human delegation. The Sulhari Civic Council's representative, a designation that had not existed in Sulhari governance in living memory, and which the Compact's procedural office had spent 12 hours creating a formal category for, testified for 4 hours. At the conclusion, the Compact's presiding officer noted for the record that the respondent had exercised his right to receive the proceedings through translation. Vol had not used the translation unit. He understood the language. Acharo had suspected this for some time. He added a footnote to his formal archive report and moved on. Acharo submitted his final formal report 14 months after the Emperor's detention. Also the day the Sulhari Civic Assembly ratified its third constitutional revision, and the last formal compact oversight mechanism for the transition was closed. He included at the end a section labeled Linguistic Notes, not standard archivant practice. The Gallarossi Archivant Office published it without revision because they trusted his judgment after 61 years of field work. The section contained one entry. The Sulhari word for surrender translates, in its formal register, as the offering of the lesser self. The word presupposes a framework in which the surrendering party acknowledges hierarchical inferiority and offers their diminished status to the superior party as a formal gift. It is not a defeat, it is a transaction. The Sulhari encountered in this conflict a species that declined the transaction not from pride or strategic calculation, but because the transaction required a premise they did not hold, that one party was inherently lesser. They had no word for this response. Their existing vocabulary had no slot for it. The closest available term in their language translates, approximately, as malfunction. He set down his stylus and did not pick it up for the rest of the day. 3 months later, Acharo returned to Voron Station for a compact administrative session he was required to attend and did not particularly want to. The inner corridor still ran through 17 atmospheric zones. The smell was still wrong in a different way every 20 meters. He still didn't notice it. The garden outside the main convening hall had been redesigned, planted by the station's resident population, which now included a small cohort of Sulhari students on an exchange program organized jointly by the Compact's New Education Office and the Sulhari Civic Assembly's Outreach Division. The flowers were growing between marked stone borders in a pattern Acharo could not identify as planned. Violet-black, 7 petals each, native to the northern ridge of a moon most people called crestfall. Grown from seeds that survivors had carried in their pockets during evacuation, then in transit, then in temporary housing, and eventually to whatever permanent address they had arrived at. Somewhere in that chain, someone had thought to bring them here. Commander Aviath Solar was standing at the garden's edge when Acharo arrived. She was not attending the administrative session. She had formally resigned her directorate commission 4 months ago and was now listed on the Compact's civilian registry as a logistics coordination consultant, a category the Compact had also created specifically because she had declined every formal diplomatic or military title offered to her. She wore civilian clothes in the same way she had worn the uniform, like something that would get the job done. Around her neck, nothing. The collarbone line was uninterrupted. Acharo stood beside her. On the low, flat stone at the garden's border, there was a small pressed flower in a laminated transit envelope. The resin had yellowed at the edges. 7 violet-black petals, held perfectly flat. Beside it, growing from the station soil in the amber afternoon light that came through the viewport above, the same flowers grew wild and unheld, their petals open.